Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 43, Samuel Skarlet, a minor Crystaleer. Raamar was not the only one who watched the dawn. All about the palace and throughout the city, the wizards and priests who'd worked the scry watched the sunrise through open windows. Most waited for full daylight to come before surrendering themselves to sleep. One of these was Master Mage Skarlet, who specialized in crystals to both store and direct magical energy. Some stones held a natural power to heal, and spelling them to enhance that created a tool for harried healers. It was a rare spell, one of several he used for the good of those who could afford it. He was a master craftsman as well as a master mage, but only in this singular form of magic. It was the only field in which his gift outshone most others. Now, though, he would have traded his wizardry to be nothing but a lowly jeweller, and to be ignorant of the evil lurking in the citadel under the mountain. He'd returned from the scry and the meeting with the gods, and immersed himself in the comfort of shaping another gem. He'd completed it by the light of 2 lamps and 3 magically enhanced crystals, and then caught the glimmer of the sunrise above the city walls. Relief had risen in his heart, and he stepped hastily to his casement window to watch the morning arrive. He'd taken his latest creation with him, holding it up to the light once he'd had his fill of the view of the mountains beyond. It was a masterpiece, and a new-found favourite. Shaped in the form of a sleeping dragon, it stood out as the best attempt yet, surpassing all the other dragons he'd fashioned in his career. The sight of it made him sigh with happiness, and he held it admiringly, until only the blue of a morning sky was reflected in the gem's scarlet. He startled at the sound of movement behind him, and glanced around, relieved to see his maid removing the warming pans from his bed. She caught his eye and gave him a beaming smile. "You need your sleep, master," she told him, and indicated the tray she'd set on the bedside table. "And to eat? No doubt it was a long night you had at the chapel." "Thank you, Agretha," he replied, and she stepped away from his bedside, smiling happily. The scent of hot bread and spiced char slowly filled the room, and the mingled scents called him over from the window seat. "Will that be all, sir?" she asked, waiting as he settled himself on the edge of the bed. The question caught at his mind, and he glanced up as though he'd only just noticed her, and his gaze settled on her chest. He paused, letting his gaze travel over the gentle swell of her breast and along the curve of her waist, and she drew a sharp breath. She was blushing when he lifted his gaze to her face. "Yes, that will be all for now," he replied, and she pivoted curtly on her heel and stalked from the room. Samuel waited until the door closed sharply behind her, then bent, smiling, to lift the cover from his tray. He caught the sight of embarrassed tears glistening in her eyes, and knew she'd caught the refusal that had been his final assessment of her. The thought made him frown, but a small, neatly wrapped package resting on the tray's edge caught his eye. His frown deepened, and he picked it up. It was much heavier than he expected, and he wished he hadn't treated the maid so crudely. If he hadn't, she might have told him from whence the package had come. "No matter," he murmured, lifting the silver bell that sat on the table. "She'll still tell me." He smiled thinly as he rang the bell. "It is, after all, I who pay her." The girl arrived shortly after, her eyes red and her face splotchy as though she'd been crying. "This parcel," he demanded, ignoring the signs of her distress. "Who brought it?" The girl's face hardened, and she shrugged. "I don't know, master. A courier brought it before first light," while he'd still been at the chapel. "Will that be all, master?" the girl asked when he didn't immediately reply. Samuel picked up the parcel and curiously turned it over in his hands. He had extended his ability to sense magic toward it, and the girl's question broke his concentration. He startled and lost the vague sense he'd been gathering of the package's contents. "What?" he snapped, glancing at her in irritation. "Will that be all, master?" the girl repeated, and he waved her irritably away. "Yes, yes, of course, you may go." This time his reply brought no answering blush or quiver of tears to Agretha's eyes. This was more like the master she knew, distant and absorbed in his work, and not giving her a passing glance, let alone the assessment she'd received before. She almost smiled as she left the room and quietly closed the door behind her, seeing Samuel turning the package carefully in his hands as she went. The wizard didn't notice her departure. He raised the package and brought it closer to his face, studying it intently. Gathering his ability to sense magic, he sent a small tendril into the parcel, probing it for any hint of its origin. The tendril revealed nothing, save for the intention for the parcel's contents to be a gift, and try as he might, Samuel could sense no guile or ill intent beyond that. Walshira had designed his present well. He watched as, with hands trembling with anticipation, Samuel began to unwrap the parcel, and felt silent satisfaction at a job well done. Walshira watched, through the eyes of the earthweird that had wormed its way into the stone walls of the wizard's house. He smiled as Samuel insulted the serving girl, knowing how out of character it was for the young wizard. "The stone already works its magic," he observed, satisfied at the effect of his gift. "That behaviour won't be so out of character soon." He watched as Samuel untied the string. The gift wasn't the only thing Walshira had included in the package. The paper, for instance, wasn't held by string alone. It was stuck in place by a very special glue, one which was sure to intrigue the mage. Walshira focused. Samuel was sure to study this strangely effective substance, and when he burnt a portion to investigate its properties, it would act as an incense that would draw the mage more fully into Walshira's power. In the meantime, the gift itself would channel Walshira's power, forming a conduit of seduction for the young man's will. Samuel had only to use it for the old one to gain power over his mind, and if he should speak to it in the same manner with which he addressed his other tools, well, if he did that, then his soul would be unable to escape Walshira's grasp. The old one smiled, imagining the sweetness of the mage's soul. Sound rippled through the earthweird's link, and the god's attention snapped back to the wizard seated at the table. The mage had spoken. For his part, Samuel didn't notice the soft bulge of the weird's eyes high up in his wall. He was too busy studying the stone he'd unwrapped. Rolling it in his hands, he brushed at the wrapping that had contained it, pushing it further back on the desk. It had taken him a while to untangle the string, but the glue dabbed strategically between the layers had almost been his undoing. It had been a relief when the paper had torn beneath his fingers. He doubted he could have made the glue let go. That particular substance had a magical aura about it that had made him wonder what else it could be made to hold, and the power of its aura promised great things. Samuel had been so busy thinking about the glue that the stone inside the package had caught him completely by surprise. He recognized the type. It was one coveted by masons and jewelers alike. As far as he could tell, it came from deep beneath the earth and was rarely found. He'd been chasing such a piece since he'd learnt of its existence almost 10 years ago. Such stones contained a magical energy that would hone, beyond perfection, the tools he used for faceting his gems. These energies, he surmised, could be improved by carving pieces of the stone in which they were trapped. He hadn't expected to be given such a piece, and had worked hard to set aside the gold needed to buy one. Unfortunately, explorers willing to plumb the depths housing such natural treasures were difficult to come by, and didn't usually return. Samuel certainly hadn't expected to be sent a carved piece of his own. Once more he wondered who had sent him such a gift. Turning the stone in his hands, he admired the piece. It was beautiful. With or without the carvings, it would have been beautiful. He peered more closely at those carvings and didn't feel like sleeping any more. Pushing back his chair, he took the stone and the paper with its string and glue across the landing to his laboratory. Cutting around the areas so firmly stuck together, he dropped them into a jar he carefully labelled glue. Setting that jar carefully on the shelf above his workbench, he focused on the stone. He had a number of tools in need of sharpening, and he itched to try out the new stone, but the mystery surrounding its arrival made him feel uneasy. He'd been in the centre ring of Endura's expedition. He'd seen the Old One's prison and its shrouding mist of light, and he'd caught a glimpse of the crack in the gem's surface. He was the one who'd have to polish out that scar, and he wasn't sure he could do it, not while maintaining the prison's integrity, and he'd told Endura as much. The big earth elemental who'd attended them had said they were searching for another gem, a replacement for the Old One's prison, and Samuel had been pleased by the thought. Now he felt a burr of irritation at the idea. Why would they need a replacement? He thought with annoyance. Why would they put such a plan in motion without consulting me? Do they have so little faith? The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he became, the feeling totally eclipsing the relief he'd felt when he'd first heard of the potential option. Why even bring him if he wasn't going to be needed? It wasn't as though he didn't have plenty of other things he could be doing. And if they found a replacement, they'd no longer need his skills. Which meant he'd lose the glory his part promised to bring him, the fame that would see him living comfortably long into retirement. And I'm not getting any younger, he muttered. Shaking his head, he set the new whetstone on the bench. There was work he should be doing downstairs in the shop. Just because he had a big day in the Lord Knight's service didn't mean his day job had stopped in his absence, and he had customers waiting. Despite this, he didn't move toward the door. His mind wouldn't settle to the tasks below, and he found himself looking for something to calm it, which turned out to be an impossible task. It wouldn't settle to the curious puzzle of the glue or the latest dragon he was carving, and he was too disturbed to sleep. Samuel sighed and stepped away from the bench. There was a lot he should be doing. That stone for the Duke of Torment's wedding ring, for instance, or the statuette to commemorate Lady Ruala's anniversary. He slipped the stone into his pocket and walked downstairs. The workshop was empty, which wasn't surprising given he'd closed it for the day. The quiet calmed him, and he felt a part of himself relax. There would be no customers to disturb him while he worked. Samuel surveyed the workbenches, then sat at the stool before the main one. This was where he kept the pieces that were highest in priority order. Shifting to make himself comfortable, he opened the drawer containing the delicate statue for Lady Ruala. It was a griffin, one of the creatures featured on her family crest. When he finished it, the creature would be standing on a branch of peace and holding a sword in its mouth. The sword was already complete, carved entirely from a single piece of silverstone, its hilt veneered in gold and set with a single, tiny emerald. The peace branch was based on a single ebon shard and decked with several slivers of emerald and set in a filigree of gold. Clusters of tiny rubies representing bunches of fruit would be the final touch. It was an ambitious project, and one he would set upon a blackwood base patterned with a golden web to which the peace branch filigree would seamlessly attach. Samuel was pleased with the design. It was one of the more inspired ideas he'd been presented in the last 2 years. Setting the statuette on the bench, he decided the branch and base could wait. It was the griffin on which he needed to focus. The work wasn't difficult, just delicate and tedious. He had to layer the feathered wings with sliver upon sliver of gemstone until they gleamed both on top and underneath with colour. It was more than slivers, though, since each tiny slice of colour was held in a silver frame until a myriad of tiny, faceted gems overlapped each, like the feathers they'd been crafted to resemble. Samuel lifted the tool he'd been using to shape the facets, gathered a tray of his tiniest stones, and shifted the magnifying lens within reach. Testing the cutting edge of the tool he was about to use, he found it blunt. The discovery left him scowling with irritation, and he reached for the sharpening stone he usually used for his tools. The new stone in his pocket nagged at him to be used, but he refused to be tempted. He wanted to test its origins first, just to be sure. Try as he might, however, Samuel couldn't rid the gift from his mind. It sat there, begging for his attention, the knowledge of its presence demanding he use it. He did, after all, want the best result for the Lady Ruala, didn't he? With a growl of frustration, he attempted to shrug the temptation away. Taking his usual honing stone, he focused on regaining the edge on his tool. He didn't notice the warmth stretching through the cloth of his pocket as the new stone began to glow. It continued to glow as Samuel finished honing the tool and replaced his usual sharpening stone to one side of the bench. Lifting the griffin from the bench, Samuel held it before him. After studying it, he chose a point at which to start and set it down. Taking a selection of chipped stones, he laid them out, setting them out in order of colour gradation. It wasn't long before he was faceting, shaping, and placing the tiny gemstones on the griffin's wings. The morning sun had climbed halfway to its zenith before the blade blunted itself beyond use. Samuel glared at it, then reached for his sharpening stone. The stone in his pocket flared with sudden brightness, and Samuel fumbled as he lifted the sharpening stone from its place. It tumbled to the floor and broke into two pieces. As Samuel stooped to pick it up, the tool he was using slipped from his hand. With a soft curse, he scooped the broken sharpening stone into the refuse tin beside his bench, then retrieved the tool. A careful examination revealed a nick in its edge, and he sighed. Now he would have to sharpen it, and carefully, or it would be ruined. Tutting to himself, he reached absent-mindedly into his pocket and took out the new tool. He hadn't realized what he'd done until he set the new stone on the bench and placed the cutter's edge against it. The sight made him pause, and he gave it a long, thoughtful stare before shrugging at what he was going to do next. The nearest alternative honing stone was in the cabinet in one corner of his workshop, and he didn't feel like getting up to fetch it. The stone on his bench gleamed, and if a warning lurked at the edge of his usually cautious mind, he failed to notice it. "Oh, well," he sighed, studying his gift. "My goddess isn't here to lend me her aid, or her advice." His voice cracked, and he paused, taking a deep breath before addressing the new stone in his hand. "Let's see what you can offer instead." In his presence within the citadel, Walshira laughed. The taste of victory was sweet. Never, never in 1,000 lifetimes of man would he have thought to gain a foothold in the wizard's soul so easily, or so soon. Not only had Samuel made use of his gift, but the wizard had actually called upon it for assistance, and in calling on it in place of his goddess, the mage had summoned the Old One's power to his aid. The crystal confines of Walshira's prison echoed with his sudden mirth. His laughter leaked through the knife-thin crack he created in his prison, then trickled into the citadel and its garden, making the guardians there shudder with worry. Walshira's laughter did not reach Samuel in his workshop, and the wizard would not have registered it if it had. He was too busy examining the newly sharpened cutter, his pleasure a palpable thing. Not only was the tool now perfectly sharp, it was almost as it had been when he'd first bought it. He extended his mage sense into the new stone. It was magical, as he'd suspected, but he sensed nothing malign or evil about it. He studied the cutter, his eyes shining in wonder, then shrugged. Perhaps the stone was just as it appeared, a gift, and nothing more.